Recording.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CPHMS webinar. Just a small request. I request everyone to mute yourselves, just for the ease of the webinar. So, and welcome you all to this webinar 12 of CPHMS. We will just wait for a minute or so, and then we will start. Thank you. In the meanwhile, I'll just lay out a few ground rules. In the sense, please ensure that your mic is off throughout the webinar, and if there are any questions to the speaker during the presentation, you could type it out in the chat box, and after the presentation we can take it up with Dr. Prajakta. And if there is anything else, please type it out in the chat box so that we would know, and then we could take it further. Hello, Dr. Akbar Shah. Hello, Dr. Radha.
Good morning. Good morning, Radha.
Good morning, Dr. Radha.
Yeah. Good morning, Shyam. This is Akbar Shah saying.
Yeah. Good morning, Dr. Shah.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah. Maybe we'll start. Dr. Prajakta. Yeah. So again, once again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 12th installment of the Center for Predictive Human Model Systems webinar. So this time we have Dr. Prajakta Dandekar, who is an assistant professor at Institute of Chemical Technology, Mumbai, who would be speaking on the hows and whys of creating human organs in a lab. Before we begin, I would like to just take a couple of minutes and present the work we do at our center, the Center for Predictive Human Model Systems. So I'll just share my screen and yeah. So the Center for Predictive Human Model Systems is housed at Atal Incubation Center, CCMB. It's a scientific and policy think tank, which is primarily established to promote the use of non-animal methods and in vitro science in biomedical and clinical research. The center has been set up in collaboration with Humane Society International India in 2019. So it's just about 2 years, just over 2 years that we have started this center. So to give a brief about our work, so as I already said, it's a scientific and policy think tank. So our aim is to increase awareness among the general audience as well as the researchers and industry as well as regulatory bodies in increasing awareness on the microphysiological systems, organ-on-organ concept, the use of in silico methods and in vitro alternatives to animal models. We also do a lot of education and training programs, in the sense we regularly conduct adverse outcome pathway workshops and EMBO lecture series and the webinar series which we are in right now. So this is all part of our education and training. We also deal with a few policy initiatives, since in the sense we have already come up with 3 white papers, each on microphysiological systems and computational biology, and adverse outcome pathways, and how those models or those systems can be furthered in India. We also had a multi-stakeholder roundtable meeting last year with participants from academia, industry, as well as funding bodies, in order to provide recommendations to the government to enable such research in India. Apart from it, we also have a few global collaborations in terms of writing book chapters and continuous engagement with other players around the world. And we also last year we also had given out funding to 2 Indian researchers to work to develop adverse outcome pathways in the field of cancer. So the roadmap of or how we enable such research in India is our goal is to establish centers of excellence. I would request someone's mic is on. I would request to please mute them. So our goal is to establish a few centers of excellence where such basic research can be carried out and further validated, and which could also be taken into preclinical studies and clinical studies to enable a connection between the technology developers, which is usually the academia, and the end users, which is the pharma or any other big companies, and take it into the market. So we also regularly engage with regulatory bodies during the technology development stages to inform them about the regulatory changes which are happening elsewhere in the world, and to bring it on par with them within the Indian context too. We also deal with enabling cross-border collaborations for tech transfer and funding, basically from industry, from academia to the industry. And one other thing which we identified was there is a lack of indigenous supply chain for reagents, chemicals, and consumables in India. So we are also trying to work to address those issues as well. So having said that, that's the brief about our work. And to know more about our center and our activities, you could visit our website, or you could also follow our social media handles. Thank you all for this. And so now I would introduce Dr. Prajakta Dandekar, the speaker of today's webinar. So Dr. Prajakta is an assistant professor of Pharmaceutical Sciences and Technology at Institute of Chemical Technology, Bombay. She has done her B Pharma, MTech, as well as PhD from ICT Bombay, and her research areas are in the areas of polymeric nanocarriers for drug and gene delivery, development of preclinical cellular models for evaluating biopharmaceuticals, 3D cell models, and tissue engineering. Recently, Dr. Dandekar also had got a BIRAC grant for bioprinting of 3D skin in a microfluidic devices for preclinical investigations, and also does a lot of research on microfluidic platforms and nanotechnology. So having said this brief introduction, I would now request Dr. Prajakta Dandekar to begin her presentation. And in the meanwhile, if there are any questions to the speaker, I would request everyone to type it out in the chat box, and we would take them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sham, and I'm really thankful to the organizers at Atal Incubation Center, CCMB, for having me over to discuss what all work we are doing in our lab in the area of alternative to animal models. And I will be presenting an overview of the various technologies which are being explored in our laboratory today. Let me just begin sharing my screen. Is the screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, Dandekar, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So, like Sham said, I work at the Institute of Chemical Technology, Mumbai, and I will briefly start by introducing you about my institute, which was set up in 1933 to help the Indian chemical industry, and we have some of the excellent programs all over India in imparting education in chemical engineering and applied chemical technology, amongst the best in pharmaceutical sciences and also in biotechnology. The impact of ICTians to this Indian society has been quite impactful, and we have more than 500 plus first generation chemical entrepreneurs who have been ex-ICTians, ICT alumni, and many of them have also been scientific advisors to Indian government, heads of national research laboratories. So these are some of the entrepreneurs from ICT, and it is typically said that you can't spend a single day in India without utilizing a product which has been developed by one ICTian or the other. These are some of the accolades of our alumni members in the International Scientific Society, medals being earned by through various organizations all over the world. and also the receipt of civilian honors by by the ICTians. And having been trained in such industrially oriented and academically stimulating environment, when I began my laboratory back in 2012, working in the area of alternative to animal models, which is an industrially relevant area, was an obvious choice. And what motivated us to concentrate on this area was to be able to overcome. So the idea is not to replace the animal models, but the idea is to reduce the burden of animal models, exploiting the various advantages of in vitro cellular models, such as being able to grow them in a relatively simple way so as to be able to use genetically homogeneous cell lines, which gives reproducibility in the cell cultures, to be able to conduct various assays in a relatively shorter period of time as compared to the animal investigations. Moreover, many of these cellular models can be developed to enable high throughput analysis of various drugs which are under development. If we are utilizing cell lines of human origin, the models closely replicate the situation within the human body. And depending upon the type of the model that you are using, you are able to have a very vigorous control over the biochemical events that are conducted during the course of the cell culture, which makes these models amenable to real-time kinetic assays when they are being utilized for preclinical studies. And not only us, but people around the world have realized the importance of these models, and they have rapidly evolved from 2D cell culture to 3D cell culture in a quest to produce physiologically relevant tissue culture models that could be utilized for preclinical investigations. There are some advantages of 3D culture over 2D culture, which I would be discussing in the next slide, which has stimulated scientists to work with various 3D cultures like matrix-based 3D cultures, spheroid cultures, organoid cultures, organ on chips, and now people are also moving forward to 4D culture involving biomimetic environments so that the cells become receptive to the external stimuli and they can mimic the various barriers which are experienced under in vivo conditions. Having realized this importance of 3D culture, there has been increasing research in this area by scientists all around the world. And as you can clearly see here, there has been a tremendous increase in the number of publications in this area, and people have explored this 3D cell culture with various tissue types, as well as for developing disease models, primarily in the area of cancer, but also in neurodegenerative diseases, in cardiovascular diseases, etc., as you can clearly see here in this graph. And as a result, the number of patents and publications in this area have drastically increased since 2017, with a compound annual growth rate of 46%. Also, the market size in the year 2021 was USD 1,300 million, and which is expected to hit almost thrice this value by the year 2000, within just a short time span of 5 years, that is by the year 2026. And as you can see in this graph, about 50% of this research is focused in cancer, so development of cancer models, and also in preclinical testing, that is in drug discovery based research. So even in the area of cancer, these models are being utilized for developing newer and more efficacious as well as safe anti-cancer agents. There is also quite a bit of research, about 20% of it being concentrated in the area of regenerative medicine, where the artificial tissues can actually be implanted, and as well as the cell therapies, which are newer cell therapies, which are being discovered for the treatment of various conditions. So overall, the trend in this area has been quite impactful, and it has been growing by the day. So what has exactly stimulated scientists to work with 3D cell culture? As you can very clearly see here, in the area of 2D cell culture, the cells are in direct contact with plastic surfaces over which, or the culture vessels which are used for cultivating the cells, and in contact with the media. But in case of 3D cell culture, because the cells are being grown in materials that are able to mimic the extracellular environment, there is an interplay, there is an interaction of the cells with that external material which is being utilized. Also, the 3D orientation of cells also helps to have cell-to-cell contact, helps us to study the cell-to-cell contact and the biochemical cues that are released because of the cell-to-cell interaction. It also enables the maintenance of gradients. So if we are developing models such as spheroid cultures, the maintenance of gradients which are similar to what exists inside the body are can be quite easily maintained. And not only with monoculture, but 3D culture can also involve co-culture of different type of cells, which helps to recapitulate the in vivo tissue architecture, and also helps us to expose it to various disease-causing conditions so as to replicate the in vivo situation such that these models can be easily utilized for preclinical investigations. So accordingly, people have utilized and explored various ways of 3D cell culture. The people have worked with spheroids by the scaffold-free approach. Also, scaffold-free approach using ultra-low attachment plates is something which has been very actively explored. Magnetic levitation has been explored. People have developed 3D cell cultures using hydrogels of various polymers and biopolymers. Similarly, electrospinning technique is something which has been found to have a very high utility in the development of a mesh-like structure of nanofibers of various polymers and biopolymers which are being utilized for cultivating the cells. So is the case also with freeze-dried scaffold, once again based on polymers and biopolymers, and relying on the technique of freeze drying. In case of large-scale cell culture, people have been utilizing bioreactors where they utilize matrices such as polymeric beads so as to cultivate the adherent cells, which are then suspended in the bioreactor so as to enable the large-scale cell culture. And although all these have been found to be extremely useful, they are still static conditions. So people have gone a step ahead so as to be able to replicate the flow conditions that exist inside the body. And that has given rise to the area of organ on chip based on microfluidic devices made up of glass or polydimethyl siloxane, which enables to replicate the flow conditions, the perfusion conditions that are experienced by the cells inside the body. And so as to have a better control over the growth of the cells, better control over the spatio-temporal orientation, and a better control over the cell numbers which are being cultivated, scientists have now resorted to bioprinting so as to have a control and reproducibility of the 3D structures that they are creating within the laboratories. So of these various techniques, we have utilized the following approaches, and I would be presenting an overview of the different studies that we have conducted in our laboratory, which are based on electrospun, polymeric biofibers. These are based on biopolymers, freeze-dried scaffolds, which are once again based on biopolymers, hydrogel-based cultures, scaffold-free spheroids based on ultra-low attachment plates, organ-on-chip models based on microfluidic devices made up of polydimethyl siloxane. And recently, we have initiated research in bioprinting of these 3D models. So, of the various tissues, we were attracted to developing these 3 models in our lab, that is the skin, the retina, and the lungs. Though there are numerous models which exist in the area of 3D skin culture, the scope of numerous formulations being developed for topical application, that is the medicated formulations being developed for topical applications, as well as the cosmetic applications being developed, is increasing by the day. And not just for those formulations which are meant for the skin, even if there are molecules which are meant for other applications, their toxicity has to be tested on the skin. So though there are models which are existing in this area, the availability of perfusion-based models in the area of 3D skin culture is something what we wanted to explore in our laboratory, and we are concentrating our efforts since the last few years on the development of such models. Retina was another area which captured our attention because it is a very delicate structure, and despite the advances in the field of medicine, we still lack precise molecules that can cater to various diseases of the eye. So it is most of the studies with the molecules which are meant for the retinal conditions, they are tested in animals. And there is a huge difference between the size of the human retina or the structure of the human retina, the cellular orientation, the cell types as compared to the animal retina. And we wanted to kind of overcome this gap by developing relevant models, 3D culture models in our laboratory, and I would be showing some of those results today as well. And the third was lungs. So it is once again a specialized organ because you have to develop a 3D cell culture at an air-liquid interface because of the breathing action that is experienced by the lungs. And despite tremendous progress in this area, the range of medications which are available for lung delivery is still limited. There is still a huge scope for newer molecules to be developed, and in vitro 3D cell culture models would be just ideal to conduct the preclinical testing of these newly developed drugs as well as delivery systems. So we have concentrated efforts in our laboratory on these three tissues, primarily the skin, the retina, and the lungs. So that brings me to the contents of today's presentation. We started with nanofibrous dressing. So these were 2D cell sheets which enabled regeneration of skin cells. And here I would be discussing about the nanofibrous dressings of starch PVA and starch TPU, which we have developed in our laboratory with success in these 2D mats, nanofibrous mats, which were developed in our laboratory in being able to regenerate skin cells. We further moved to 3D tissue engineering, skin tissue engineering in the form of freeze-dried scaffolds of biopolymers. Later on, these were scaffold-based. So we decided to shift the focus of our research towards developing scaffold-free or matrix-free 3D cell culture models. And there we developed spheroid-based models of lung cancer spheroids and retinal spheroids in ultra-low attachment plates, which enabled us to develop or obtain single spheroid per well in a completely matrix-free manner, and which I would be also discussing today. And then, though these models were successful in the in vitro investigations that we conducted, we still wanted to move a step closer to the in vivo situation. That is, we wanted to work with perfusion-based conditions, which is why we concentrated our research on organ-on-chip development, where we are working with microfluidic devices made up of PDMS, and those have been utilized for development of skin tissue as well as the retinal tissue. And like I said, in order to have a better control over reproducibility and also the spatio-temporal orientation of the tissues that we are developing in our laboratory, we have recently focused our research to 3D bioprinting, where we have initiated research in 3D printing of bioprinting of skin. So wound dressings, why are they important? So there are different types of wounds as have been listed on this slide: the open wounds, which have been contributed by burns, surgical wounds or trauma-based wounds. Closed wounds are the blisters and ulcers, the diabetic foot ulcer and the pressure ulcer. The diabetic foot ulcer are especially a problem in our country because of the very heavy load of diabetic patients who exist in our country. And despite a tremendous change in the kind of dressings which are available in the market, right from the traditional dressings, that is the cotton gauze-based dressings which were available, to now the bioactive and medicated dressings and the tissue-engineered substitutes which are available. Most of the advanced dressings which are available in the market are imported in nature. And the people who are suffering from burn-related wounds, majority of them belong to the lower socioeconomic strata of the society, especially in our country. So we felt that after talking to clinicians in the National Burn Center, Airoli, we felt that there was a tremendous need to develop an indigenous effective bandage which could be easily removed and which would reduce the trauma which is experienced by the patients, which is where we concentrated our study. So the issue was high mortality and mortality of the burn-related patients, majority of whom belong to the lower socioeconomic strata of the society, and the need for having a holistic approach, that is apart from being able to heal the wounds well, the trauma that is faced by the patients when the dressings are being changed or the dressings are being removed, there is a need to develop newer interventions which can make the lives of patients better. That is to have safe and effective materials that can reduce the pain during removal and replacement of these dressings, and which is why we decided to focus our research on nanotech-based dressings, which were created by the technique of electrospinning, a very widely used technique in the area of textile design. And our goal was to be able to synthesize inexpensive dressings which were made up of indigenous materials using scalable technology. So electrospinning is a readily scalable technology that has already been utilized in the textile industry, so as to be able to develop an alternative bandage that would help to heal the wounds by multiple synergistic mechanisms. Also, the global advanced wound care market has clearly indicated an increasing demand for the combination dressing so that the wound can be healed through multi-strategic approaches, which is also what we are focusing in our laboratory. And with the aim to address all these needs, we are developing electrospun bandages, nanofibrous bandages in our laboratory, which are based on biopolymers, which are cheaply available, which are indigenous, and which can help to heal the wounds without causing any extra pain to the patients while application and removal of those bandages. So the first type of nanofibrous dressing which we have developed in our laboratory is the starch-based dressing. And we studied the morphology of the nanofibrous dressing that we developed by FESEM, and it revealed to us a porous and dense meshwork, which you can clearly see here. The pore size of these bandages were roughly around 50 to 60 nanometers, and these bandages were utilized with excellent cellular proliferation. Later on, we felt the need to give some kind of antibacterial action to these bandages, which is why we loaded these bandages with silver nanoparticles. What you can see here in the upper right corner of this slide is the TEM image of the silver nanoparticles, indicating a homogeneously dispersed silver nanoparticles that we have incorporated in our bandages. And in order to improve the mechanical strength of our bandages, we cross-link them with various concentrations of glutaraldehyde. The final concentration was optimized somewhere at around 12.5% of glutaraldehyde. The porosity of these non-cross-linked bandages was somewhere around 65, and after cross-linking, the porosity went down to for about 45%, but it was still high enough to allow the cellular proliferation across the structure of the bandages which we have developed. We later on also checked the release of the silver nanoparticles from our cross-linked nanomats in PBS alone, and in PBS in combination with lysozyme. Now, lysozyme was incorporated into the PBS so as to be able to mimic the tissue wound environment. So wound environment always has a lot of degradative enzymes, and lysozyme was used to represent that. And as you can clearly see here, the release pattern of the silver nanoparticles. Now, the silver nanoparticles were loaded at the concentration of 0.2 milligram per gram of the cross-linked nanofibrous mats, and the release pattern of the silver nanoparticles was much faster in case of presence of lysozyme. It was the pattern is in a sustained manner or in a continuous manner, and we wanted to include lysozyme so that we had an idea of how the bandages would behave once we utilize them in animal models, or once we utilize them further also in for clinical applications. So at the end of about 21 days, about 80% of these silver nanoparticles were released into the external medium. Later on, we also conducted cell proliferation studies using various the bandages that were developed, the nanofibers that were developed with different concentrations of the polymers. Here we have utilized a combination of starch, and PVA was used to give flexibility or impart flexibility to these fibers. And as you can see, at the end of 21 days, the bandage containing 10% starch PVA combination had the maximum proliferation, whereas the bandages containing higher polymer concentrations resulted in lower proliferation. Now, what we thought could be a reason was a higher polymer concentration. So a higher polymer concentration in these bandages would mean that there would be more number of free hydroxyl groups that would be occupied by the cross-linking agent. And also the pore size of these bandages, owing to the presence of a higher polymer concentration, would be smaller. The porosity would be smaller, which we had already observed when we had conducted the porosity studies of the nanofibrous dressings, and which is why the mats containing 10% of polymer combination, they gave us sufficiently high cellular proliferation to be taken up for further studies. And thereafter we cultured dermal cells over these nanofibrous mats. What we found here is that the cells proliferated and grew very well on the matrices, indicating the safety of the matrices for the dermal culture. These were primary dermal cells, primary dermal fibroblasts, which have been utilized for these studies. Also, the cells, they grew around the pores, and pores are responsible for providing nutrients as well as to carry away the waste materials that are pass through the bandages, and that may have resulted in a higher cell density at the pore edges of the matrices. But nonetheless, the HNE staining clear, that is Yosin staining, clearly indicated to us that our bandages were suitable for a high degree of cellular proliferation as well as cellular growth. Later on, we have also developed a combination of starch and TPU based bandages. What you are able to see here in the upper left corner is the non-cross-linked fibers. So you can see a mesh-like network, a porous mesh-like network, and these open pores are extremely necessary to allow cellular respiration, to be able to absorb wound exudates when the matrices are being utilized for wound healing. And as you can see here, in case of non-cross-linked fibers, the fibers were very thin in nature. They were clearly distinctly separated from each other, and the sizes of these fibers, the diameters of these fibers, were somewhere around 200 micrometers. Later on, we also subjected these fibers to cross-linking with various concentrations of glutaraldehyde, and at the optimized concentrations, because of the presence of the cross-linking agent, the mats showed a sort of swelling. The diameter of the fibers also increased to 220, around 220 nanometers. And later on, the cross-linked matrices, which had sufficient mechanical strength, were utilized for cellular proliferation studies. Once again, as you can clearly see here, that even after 2 days, the cell proliferation was greater than 90%, which clearly indicates that the matrix or the matrices which we had developed in our laboratory were extremely suitable for the growth of the dermal cells, which we were utilizing during the course of these studies. Then we utilized these bandages also in vivo wound healing models in rats. And as you can see here, we have used 3 groups. These are the starch TPU bandage group, which have been developed in our laboratory, the positive control and the negative control. The positive control was the cotton gauze, and the negative control was uncovered wound. And as you can see here, the extent of wound healing in case of starch TPU bandages was about 92%, which was maximum as compared to both the positive and the negative control. Now, we also conducted HNE staining of the wound dressing treated group. That is, the tissues of the healed tissues were embedded in paraffin blocks and were subjected to HNE staining, that is hematoxylin Yosin staining. And what you can clearly see here is a formation of a keratinized layer. And thereafter, we are also able to see the formation of the subcutaneous tissues and the keratinized layers, and the proliferation of cells was seen in the form of retroridges, as you can clearly see here. Also, the percentage of the inflammatory cells, the fibroblasts, etc., was very minimum. There were also a fair amount of collagen which was being deposited in the tissue, and that clearly indicated the ability of the scaffolds to be able to heal the wounds as compared to the gauzes, the traditional gauze materials, and as compared to the untreated wounds. Later on, we have also developed chitosan Alwan based nanofibrous mats, and Alwan here is a anionic polymer. It is obtained from seaweeds. So we utilized it with chitosan, it gave rise to electrostatic interaction, and PVA gave the needed flexibility to these bandages. And the chitosan alwan based bandages, their sugar components have structures which are very similar to glycosaminoglycans, that is molecules such as heparin, chondroitin sulfate, etc. Therefore, the alwan polymer is expected to have or is known to have thrombocytic action. It is also known to have a wound healing action, which is why we used a combination of this polymer along with chitosan, which is also known to have wound healing properties. And the cellular proliferation acid, further these mats were cross-linked using various concentrations of citric acid, and 2% concentration of citric acid, the mats which were developed using 2% concentration of citric acid gave us a very high cellular proliferation even after 3 days of cell culture. This is the live dead cell assay which was conducted, and the Z-stack image clearly sees that a greater percentage of the fluorescently labeled green cells, the green cells are due to the calcine AM dye which is being utilized and which stains the live cells. And as you can clearly see, the percentage of the live cells is much higher than the dead cells, which clearly indicates the safety of our bandages and the potential of our bandages for the wound healing process. So having had success in the development of the 2D matrices, which were able to regenerate the skin tissue, we further focused our attention for the development of 3D scaffolds, which were based on, once again, biopolymers. Here we utilize the process of lyophilization or freeze drying to be able to construct bioengineered matrices for in vitro skin development. So this is an overview of the study that we have conducted. We have used a combination of starch with gelatin, which was cross-linked together. Further, this solution was processed by freeze drying to have a porous polymeric scaffold. And the scaffold was utilized for the development of 3D co-culture of the dermal cells as well as the epidermal cells, that is epidermal keratinocytes and dermal fibroblasts. And it was also studied in animal models so as to confirm the process of tissue regeneration. So our goal here was to engineer bioartificial skin substitutes for the treatment of burns and as well as diabetic foot ulcer, and to use economically viable and readily accessible biomaterials like starch, which also have wound healing properties by themselves, along with gelatin. So gelatin is it is depolymerized collagen. So because of its structural similarity to collagen, it is able to promote proliferation, etc., which is why we use this polymer in combination with starch so as to be able to produce reproducible, reliable, and safe as well as effective 3D scaffolds. So these are the results of our study. As you can clearly see here, porous structure, 3D structure is formed, the porosity. Now we shortlisted 2 structures, one with a lower polymer combination and concentration and one with a higher polymer concentration. Both these scaffolds had a porosity in the range of 81 to 83%. Later on, we utilized these scaffolds for cellular proliferation studies. And when we studied the cellular proliferation over a period of 14 days, we observed that the cellular activity was quite high, and that indicated sufficient cellular attachment, proliferation, self-infiltration through the scaffolds. This we also studied by fluorescent microscopy and by staining the cells with the help of DAPI. And as you can see here, the dermal fibroblasts which we used in this study, they penetrated throughout the length of the scaffold, throughout the scaffold structure, and they were able to penetrate to 1200 micrometers and 800 micrometers for the scaffolds containing lower polymer concentration and higher polymer concentration respectively. Later on, we developed a skin substitute using the same scaffold, and we conducted H&E staining for the same. And as you can clearly see here, there is a epidermal layer that is formed. The fibroblasts have been well distributed. The skin cells have been well distributed throughout the scaffold, and the scaffold structure was still existing at the end of 28 days, which indicated the stability of the scaffold over the period of time that is required for in vitro skin tissue regeneration. Later on, we also use these scaffolds for in vivo studies. The scaffolds were embedded into animals. We tested it in 3 groups. We had our own scaffolds, which had been developed in the laboratory, that is the cell-seeded scaffolds. We had the cell-free scaffolds, and we also had the negative control, which was just an open wound that was not treated with any of the scaffold. And as you can clearly see here, when we conducted the HNE section, that is at the end of the study period, at the end of 21 days, we excised the regenerated tissue. What you can see here is formation of skin tissue appendages, which have been shown by the white arrows. We are also able to see the formation of epidermal layer, and we are able to see stratified dermal layer, which has been clearly formed at the end of 21 days. And these are the results at the end of 21 days, but as early as after 10 days of initiating the experiment, the scaffold-based material was readily integrated into the surrounding tissue. This is because of the biopolymeric combination that we had used in this scaffold. Later on, we checked the expression of CD31 cells. Now, CD31 is the marker which is used for endothelial cells, and that confirmed the formation of newer blood vessel generation, that is the neovascularization, as you can see in the green stained structures here. We also tested the scaffold sections, that is the healed wound, for CD11B. Now, this particular marker is for the granulocytes, and we did not find too many granulocytes in the structure, which indicated that there were no inflammatory markers which were present, and the wound healing process was a gradual one. It was a very benign one, and it did not generate any inflammatory reactions within the tissue. We also conducted Mason's trichome staining, which indicates a clear deposition of collagen tissue in the healed structure. So the formation of collagen clearly indicated the ability of the scaffolds to promote wound healing and accelerate the wound closure, which we found in our study. So now we had developed a 3D structure which was matrix based in our laboratory already. So as a next obvious step, we wanted to move towards developing those tissues in absence of the matrices. And this is what we did when we developed the 3D spheroid cultures using ultra low attachment plates. So now, what is the advantage of using developing scaffold-free spheroids as against those spheroids which involve the use of some matrices? Okay. Now, the scaffold-free spheroids are formed due to the self-assembling capability of the cells. So they are very easy to form. They can be easily traced. They can be easily recovered during the studies. They can be easily analyzed as against the scaffolds, as against the spheroids which have been made based on some matrix or the other. Also, in case of matrix-dependent spheroids, more than one spheroids are formed per well, which makes the tracing, recovery, and analysis a little bit difficult. Also, the scaffold-free spheroid culture is able to give us consistent spheroid sizes. The diffusion of the nutrients through these spheroids is relatively better. The process is due to the spontaneous self-assembly capability of the cells. It is able to give us reproducibly sized spheroids with lower risk of contamination because we are not using any external polymeric matrix. Also, the intraspheroid cell-cell contact governs the response, the cellular responses in this case, and they are not dependent on the matrix as in case of the scaffold dependent spheroid culture, and which is why we decided to develop scaffold-free spheroids in our laboratory, especially for lung as well as for retina. So people have recognized the advantages of spheroid culture, which is why they have been increasingly utilized in the area of oncology. Now, in the area of oncology, they represent very adequate models because in the spheroid culture, you are able to recapitulate the central necrotic core that is observed in the in vivo tumor formation. So the same can be easily replicated if we are developing a 3D culture in the form of spheroids, which is why they have been maximum utilized in the area of oncology. However, apart from oncology, they have been also utilized in various other applications, such as in basic research to understand the cellular responses, and also in the development of various preclinical assays, cell culture systems, models, etc., to be able to represent various disease conditions when newer drug molecules and delivery systems are to be tested, which is why there has been a tremendous improvement in the spheroid culture-based research over the years, and this is expected to grow at the compound annual growth rate of 22.8% till the year 2028. What we have developed in our laboratory is a 3D lung spheroid culture. Lungs, like I earlier said, they're specialized structures because of the air-liquid interface that exists between them. And you have alveoli, which are present in the form of lobes and which can be easily recapitulated with the help of the spheroid culture. What we have developed in our laboratory is, again, matrix-free spheroids with the help of ultra-low attachment plates. And these spheroids were studied for their growth, for cell viability, and they were also studied for their ability to uptake nanoparticles. Further, one of the hallmark properties of cancer is the cancer dissemination to or metastasis to other organs. So that was studied with the potential of the spheroid to be able to recapitulate this was studied with the help of invasion assay. So we have developed two different kinds of spheroids in our laboratory. We developed co-culture spheroids. Now, co-culture spheroids represent better models for lung culture because of the diversity of the cells that are existing inside the lungs. And we have developed two co-culture based spheroid models, one with A549, a cancer cell line, and WI38 fibroblast cell line, and another one NCIH 460 cancer cell line, and WI38 once again the fibroblast cell line. And what we observed here is that with the help of ultra low attachment plates, which we were able to develop, get reproducibly sized spheroids having a diameter of somewhere at the scale of 300 micrometers. Moreover, we were able to achieve only one spheroid per well due to the specialty of the technique that we have developed in our laboratory. We wanted to see the growth of the individual cell types in the spheroids. So which is why we trace the cells or track the cells with the help of cell tracker dyes. And we use different cell tracker dyes for the cancerous cells as well as the fibroblast cell line. And what we found is that at the end of 72 hours, the percentage of the cells, both the cell types in the co-culture spheroids had increased. So the spheroids were able to grow in size over a period of time. However, when we checked the viability as compared to 2D culture, the viability of the spheroids was low, as you can see here from the blue graph here. And that is majorly because the spheroids were able to recapitulate the central necrotic core of the tumoroids or of the tumors or of the actual structures or the in vivo structures which are formed within the body. Later, we also studied these spheroids for their ability to be utilized for testing various anti-cancer drugs as well as anti-cancer drug delivery systems. And here we have utilized paclitaxel-loaded Eudrogen nanoparticles. So these Eudrogen nanoparticles had a positive charge. And as a control, we also utilized plain paclitaxel at the same concentration, that is at the concentration of 0.6 micromolars, at which it was loaded into the paclitaxel nanoparticles. And as you can see here, in case of monolayer, so that has been depicted here by the white graph, there was a clear decrease in the viability of the cells. However, the decrease in the viability of the spheroid culture was not as great as in case of monoculture. Now, one reason for this is that the spheroid is a three-dimensional structure. So the the cells which are present at the periphery of the spheroids, they present diffusional limitations and they do not allow enough quantity of the drug to enter into the spheroids, which is very similar to what exists inside the body. Also, because of the hypoxic core of the spheroids which is generated, the cell responses get altered, the cells are altered, and they become kind of resistant to the drugs which are being administered. So the spheroids were able to recapitulate the conditions which exist inside the body, and they presented similar responses to the drugs as well as the drug-loaded delivery systems, as you can clearly see in this cell viability assay when the spheroids were treated with plain paclitaxel as well as paclitaxel loaded nanoparticles. Now, like I said, one of the hallmarks of cancer is cancer metastasis. That is the ability of the cells to disseminate and to go to different parts of the body, and which we have studied here. Here, the spheroids were grown on gelatin-coated surfaces. They were once again treated with paclitaxel nanoparticles and paclitaxel API. As a control, we utilized untreated spheroids. And as you can clearly, so these are the spheroids in the panel A. We have spheroids of only A549 cells. In panel C, we have spheroids of only NCIH460 cells, both of which are cancerous cells. And here we have the co-culture spheroids which have been developed with A549 in combination with WI38, which is a fibroblast cell line, and an NCIH460 in combination with WI38. Now, as you can see here, in case of the spheroids that were treated with paclitaxel nanoparticles, the spheroids were not able to invade, or the cell migration of the spheroids was very low, as you can clearly see from this white line which has been marked here. However, in case we wanted to see if paclitaxel API by itself had the same effect, but surprisingly, when we treated the spheroids with paclitaxel API, the dissemination, the cellular migration capacity of the spheroids was not affected much. Now, one reason for this is that it is a very low solubility of paclitaxel in the external medium which we are utilizing. Also, the central necrotic core of the spheroids could have created problem and could have presented drug resistance, so that the drug was not able to act on the cells the way it should have, which is why we have been observing these results. However, in case of paclitaxel nanoparticles, the nanoparticles, because of their small size, were easily taken up by the spheroids, which is why the invasion potential of the spheroids is considerably lower. Also, as we increase the duration of exposure of the spheroids to these nanoparticles, the size of the spheroids reduced, and this was even more so in case of NCIH460. Also, in case of co-culture spheroids, the invasion potential was higher as in case of monoculture spheroids, and this might have been due to the ability of WI38, that is the fibroblast cell line, in helping the cells to migrate further as compared to the monoculture spheroids that we see here. So overall, what we concluded from this investigation is that our lung co-culture spheroids could be utilized as an ideal model for testing anti-cancer drugs, as well as their delivery systems, checking both their efficacy as well as toxicity, as you can clearly see via these studies. Yet another type of spheroids which we have developed in our laboratory is the spheroids for diabetic retinopathy, which is a complication of the eye, especially in case of diabetic patients. It is a vision-threatening condition. The vascular endothelial growth factor in this case induces neovascularization, that is development of new blood vessels, which causes metabolic damages, and it could, in the diabetic patients, it could ultimately lead to vision loss, and it is a highly debilitating condition. The number of cases is expected to grow till 2040 to almost 642 million. And this condition is being currently treated with laser therapy, which is highly invasive in nature. Corticosteroids are another mainstay treatments, but they have their own adverse effects. Anti-VEGF therapies such as anti-VEGF monoclonal antibodies, etc., are also being utilized. However, the route of administration is problematic, and also is the ocular complications that they result in. And like I said earlier, animals are the mainstay models, but because of the differences in the size as well as the biological responses of animal eyes as compared to human eyes, there is an extreme need of developing a model that will recapitulate the conditions that exist in the human eye, and which is what we have tried to do in our laboratory. So what we have used here is RF6A rhesus retinal endothelial cells, and these we have used to develop once again matrix-free spheroids with the help of ultra-low attachment plates. Why we chose these cells is because they are from retinal endothelium, which is the primary target of damage in case of diabetic retinopathy. So the spheroids were once again developed by matrix-free approach using ultra-low attachment plate, and we were able to get only one spheroid per well. The spheroids were homogeneous in their sizes. As you can clearly see here, we tried to develop spheroids with different number of cells per well, that is different cell density per well, and we also cultured them over a period of several days. And what we found is that a cell density of 5,000 cells per well was suitable for developing adequate spheroids, and the spheroids had the sizes roughly of about 250 nanometers. We also conducted the live dead cell assay by using calcine and propylium iodide, and what you can see here is that the percentage of live cells is clearly higher than the percentage of dead cells. Now we wanted to see whether the spheroid structure was a solid one or whether it had a hollow core, and we could not identify this with the help of confocal microscopy, which is why we conducted histological staining of the sections of the spheroid. And as you can clearly see here, the spheroid is a very solid structure. The cells are distributed throughout the central core of the spheroid to represent the conditions which exist inside the body. Now, we also wanted to see whether the model was capable of being utilized for testing the drug delivery systems against a diabetic retinopathy, for which we conducted the sprout formation assay in the presence of vascular endothelial growth factor. And as you can clearly see here, the sprout formation was clearly seen, which indicated the suitability of this model for being able to be utilized for testing drugs and drug delivery systems against diabetic retinopathy. Further, we validated the model using VEGF, that is vascular endothelial growth factor, various concentrations of VEGF. We also utilized bevacizumab. Now, bevacizumab is an anti-angiogenic monoclonal antibody, anti-VEGF monoclonal antibody that is being utilized for inhibiting the action of VEGF. And that was also being utilized at different concentrations. What we saw in this case is that when we treated the spheroids with VEGF till 50 nanograms per ml, the cellular proliferation in the spheroids remained the same. But after that, once the spheroid crossed a certain size, a necrotic core must have been formed in the spheroid, and that must have created a significant concentration gradient between the VEGF that was present in the external medium and the core of the spheroid, and that drew the VEGF into the inside the spheroid. That concentration gradient was the main driving factor for the VEGF to be driven into the spheroid, which is why the cellular proliferation increased when we used higher concentrations of VEGF. Now, the sizes of the spheroids reduced when we treated with different concentrations of bevacizumab, and the results were highly significant with 4 mg per ml of bevacizumab. When we used a combination of VEGF and bevacizumab, similar results were observed. Here, more significant results were observed when we utilized 4 mg per ml of bevacizumab. That is, we utilized a combination of VEGF 50 nanogram per ml and bevacizumab. So in all, the spheroid model was able, or it was found to be a suitable model for testing the preclinical efficacy of various drugs and delivery systems that could be possibly developed against diabetic retinopathy. We found similar results also in case of 3D sprouting assay. So this is what you can see. This is the mean sprout length, which we have analyzed with the help of a computer software, that is WinSprout analysis. And as you can see here, in case of control spheroids, there is limited sprouting. When we treat the spheroids with 50 nanogram per ml of VEGF, the sprout length increases, the mean sprout length increases. When the spheroids are treated with 0.1 mg per ml and 4 mg per ml, the sprout length also decreases, which indicates the anti-angiogenic potential of bevacizumab and the suitable of this model for representing the diabetic retinopathy condition. We also used a combination of VEGF and different concentrations of bevacizumab. And what you can see here is that when we used a combination of VEGF and 0.1 mg per ml of bevacizumab, the sprout length was not significant, or the sprouting was not significantly affected. However, with 4 mg per ml, the sprouting was significantly affected. And this once again established the suitability of these models for testing, screening the existing and forthcoming pharmacological interventions against diabetic retinopathy. So all these models, though they were found to be successful in various in vivo studies as well as the in vitro studies that we have conducted and which I have presented before you, these are still static models. So they do not really represent the flow conditions which are experienced or the perfusion conditions which are experienced inside the body. So in order to improve the physiological likeness of these models, we decided to work with microfluidic devices. And we developed organ-on-chip models for two different tissues, that is the skin as well as the retina. Here the microfluidic device was developed with the help of PDMS. So like I've shown here that the organ-on-a-chip device is shows greater physiological likeness to the in vivo situation because of the flow conditions that it is able to recapitulate, and which we wanted to capture also in our studies. So these are the advantages. It combines the advantages of 3D cell culture, which I have already presented before you, along with perfusion, that is continuous flow conditions that is experienced inside the body. Apart from it, it also has other advantages. The organ-on-chips also have other advantages such as lower consumption of media and buffer, higher cell density, good mass transfer rate, gas permeability, laminar flow conditions, which represent the conditions that are faced by the cells inside the body, flexibility of fabrication, real-time analysis, precise operation control, and also adaptability to high throughput screening so that these can be adapted as models for preclinical investigations. So what does our skin-on-chip combine? Like I said, it is a combination of 3D tissue culture along with microfluidic technology to develop an organotypic co-culture. We have developed a co-culture of the two major skin cell types, that is the epidermal cells, epidermal keratinocytes, and the dermal fibroblasts. And we were also, because of the use of the microfluidic device, we were able to maintain dynamic flow conditions within the device, which gave us more in vivo-like cellular organization, also the possibility of developing an air-liquid interface and flow mimicking the fluid flow inside the microfluidic device was low enough so as to mimic the skin that which exists in skin vasculature. Therefore, this model can serve as an excellent alternative to animal model. Moreover, the microfluidic devices are amenable to commercial manufacture, and they are also amenable for high throughput screening. So a prototype skin-on-a-chip device was designed and fabricated by using micro-machining and soft lithography, as you can see here. And there is a single compartment in the upper layer of this microfluidic device. There is a channel that flows below the microfluidic device to give rise to the perfusion conditions. Further, we use this device for the development of co-culture of the epidermal keratinocytes and the dermal fibroblasts, and this is the day 5 co-culture where the individual cell types have been tagged with the help of cell tacker dyes, and that confirmed the possibility or the ability of this device to support the 3D skin co-culture. This is the day 7 3D co-culture, the 3-dimensional, the 3D images of the same, and that once again proved the capability of the microfluidic device to support the culture of skin cells and to maintain the 3D conformation. And finally, we grew the co-culture, or we sustained the co-culture up to a period of 10 days. Thereafter, the cells were tracked with different cell tracker dyes, and we used Perkin-Elmer's high content imaging system so as to understand the orientation of the cells. And what we found here is that this study confirmed the potential of the microfluidic device to support an organotypic co-culture. That is, the orientation was very similar to what exists in vivo skin, and therefore it was proved to be a suitable model for biomedical and preclinical applications. Further, we also tested the immunofluorescence studies in the individual cell types. Here, primary dermal fibroblasts were found to express the protein called as vimentin, and the keratinocyte cells demonstrated the expression of cytokeratin-1 markers. Thus, this proof of concept study clearly indicated to us that HADF cells and Huckat cells, that is the dermal fibroblasts and keratinocytes, could be cultivated very well, and a co-culture model could be successfully developed in the PDMS device which we have developed in our laboratory. The next on-chip concept that we developed in our laboratory was the retina on-chip, and why we use microfluidic approach is once again, because it is amenable to high throughput screening, it is able to simulate the perfusion conditions, which improves the physiological likeness of this device. Moreover, it can be produced on a very large scale, so its translation capacity is much higher than the other type of devices, and the microfluidic devices also provide an operational control and versatility. So we have developed a dual chamber microfluidic device with the help of PDMS, that is polydimethyl siloxane. And this consisted of 3 layers, as has been shown here. The flow directions we analyzed with the help of computational fluid dynamic studies, and what we found that when the pressure drop was calculated at the flow rate of 5 microliters per minute, the pressure drop was 3.8 into 10 raised to minus 5 bars, which was considerably lower, so that the cells which were cultivated at the base of the microfluidic device, they would not experience any kind of stress. Further, we used this polydimethyl siloxane device for culturing 2 different cell types. So we use retinal pigment epithelial cells and retinal precursor cells. Since we were using 2 different cell types, we optimized the ratio of the individual media that were utilized for the individual cell types. And what we found is that normalized cellular proliferation and cellular activity was observed when the media were utilized at the ratio of 1:1, as you can clearly see here. And we conducted live dead cell imaging analysis by growing these 2 cell types within the device, that is the retinal pigment epithelial cells and the retinal precursor cells, that is the R28 cells. And what the cell viability which was observed was greater than 98%, and that confirmed the ability of this of the device to support the co-culture of these 2 cell types. Later on, the retinal precursor cells, that is R28 cells, were assessed for the the retinal pigment epithelial cells were assessed for the presence of the RPA65 proteins, which is expressed by these cells. And the immunocytochemistry analysis clearly indicated the presence of RP65 protein, which is observed as green fluorescence here. The retinal precursor cells were assessed for the expression of both the photoreceptor as well as the neuronal markers. Here, the photoreceptor marker, the cellular protein recoverin is the primary protein that is present in the photoreceptor cells, which you can clearly see being expressed here. And PAX6 is something which is expressed by the neuronal cells, and that was also seen here. So that kind of exhibited the capacity of the retinal precursor cells to exhibit both different kind of properties, that is photoreceptor kind of properties as well as the neuronal properties. Now, the photoreceptor cells, in disease conditions like age-related macular degeneration or diabetic retinopathy, etc., the photoreceptor cells are the ones which undergo cell death. And that is because of an expression of increase in the inflammatory markers. So as a representation of that, we measured the concentration of TNF alpha in both the cells which were grown in the static system as well as in the perfusion system. And what you can see here is the expression of TNF. So the TNF alpha was measured in the in the cell culture fluid, in the cell culture medium in this case. And you see here in absence of stimulation. As a inflammatory inducer or inflammation inducer, the level of TNF alpha, both in case of the retinal epithelial cells as well as the retinal precursor cells, it was significantly higher. And the TNF alpha levels was also higher in case of the co-culture of both the cell types, that is the retinal epithelial cells and the retinal precursor cells. Okay. Now, the photoreceptor cells express a protein called as rhodopsin, which is found in the, which is responsible for light perception. So what we did is that we exposed the cell culture to light of the monoculture light of the wavelength of 405 nanometer. And what we observed here is rhodopsin was clearly expressed, as you can see by the green fluorescence here. Later on, when we expose the cells to light, it results in the degradation of the cells. And it also results in the degradation of the protein, which can be clearly seen here. In case when we had exposed the cells to blue light, the blue violet light of the wavelength of 405 nanometer, the viability of the cell reduced. And we thought that since the mechanism was not well understood, we also measured the amount of the TNF alpha. And what we found is that in the light exposed culture, the level of TNF alpha in the medium significantly increases. So TNF alpha is responsible for inducing apoptosis in the cells, and that also gives rise to further deterioration of the eye, such as loss of vision or detachment of the cellular layer, causing blindness. So what we basically concluded from this, also the intensity of the rhodopsin in case of the cells that were exposed to light significantly reduced as compared to the control. And therefore this particular model which we have developed is clearly able is clearly capable of being developed into a disease model, a model which can represent different conditions such as AMD or diabetic retinopathy, etc. And it can be utilized for testing various drugs and pharmaceuticals which are being developed against these conditions. And finally, we tried to integrate the advantages of bioprinting, that is ability to give rise to automation, having a better control, precision, reproducibility, and improving the industrial applicability. And therefore, very recently, we have initiated research in bioprinting of 3D skin in our laboratory. In the interest of time, I will keep this section small, a little short. So what you can see here is the trials which are being conducted with the bioprinting device using an indigenous bioprint ink which we have developed in our laboratory. It is once again based on degradable biopolymers. These biopolymers were cross-linked with combination of cross-linking agents so as to increase their mechanical stability. Various sterilization protocols were tried where we found that a combination of dry heat sterilization and autoclave gave us the desired results. And these are the studies which indicate the syringe force that is required to extrude the bioink along with the cells in the case of this extrusion-based bioprinter that we are utilizing. So these are the various team members who have worked on all these projects throughout the years. Some of them masters, many of them are doing their doctorate with me or have done their doctorate with me. Our technologies are at various technology readiness levels, as can be clearly seen here. These are the outcomes of the 3D cell culture based research from the laboratory. The publications of nanofibrous scaffolds, freeze-dried scaffolds, bioprinting, as well as spheroids, the patents which we have generated throughout this duration. I'm extremely thankful to the various funding agencies which have made this research possible. And once again, I thank you all for your kind attention. And yeah, I shall be happy to answer any questions that you may
have. Thank you, Dr. Dandekar, for the interesting presentation. So there are a few questions in the chat box. In the meanwhile, if there are any other questions, I would request people to type in, and then we could take them. There are a few questions from Dr. Leena Chandrasekhar. So the first question is, how do you model blood capillary interface in lung spheroids? And following that is, what is the protocol for invasion or migration of the spheres?
So this manuscript has been very recently published. So I would really ask, I would request you to go to the manuscript and see the protocol. But what we have done in case of the invasion assay is that we have embedded the spheroids in coated plates and conducted those investigations. And those at an ALI, that is, it is not a air-liquid interface culture. These are submerged that we have developed.
Thank you. There's another one from Dr. Lina itself. Can you explain the orientation of cells checked by PerkinElmer in the company?
Orientation as in the 3D orientation? Yes.
Yeah.
So that, which is why it is a high content imaging analysis system, and we utilized it to be able to understand whether the orientation of the two layers of the co-culture which we have developed was similar to what exists under in vivo conditions. And when we had developed the co-culture for a period of 10 days and tested it with the cell tracker dyes and use of this high content imaging system, we were able to see that orientation. So yes, basically that system could be utilized to understand the cellular orientation.
There are a few questions by Abhinaba Banerjee. First question is, what are the possible and best techniques for incorporation of nanoparticles into scaffolds to develop in vitro disease models, say cancer models?
So here we have incorporated nanoparticles when we conducted the electrospinning. So the nanoparticles were incorporated into our polymeric solutions itself when we subjected them to electrospinning. So that way the nanoparticles were embedded into the nanofibers that were electrospun.
Yeah. Following
but
that,
the same can also be done in case of freeze-dried scaffolds. If you incorporate the nanoparticles within your polymeric solutions, they would be embedded into your scaffolds essentially.
Yeah. A follow-up question to that is, how would the presence of nanoparticles in the scaffold hydrogel affect the proliferation of cells seeded into the porous hydrogels?
So as long as the nanoparticles or the drug which is loaded inside the nanoparticles is not toxic to the cells, the inclusion of the nanoparticles would not be problematic. Why we had included the nanoparticles in our scaffolds is that we actually wanted the scaffolds to have some antibacterial property. So generally in case of skin healing, silver is a very commonly used material which is utilized for, so silver sulfadiazine or such formulations are being very commonly utilized as antibacterial agents. So as to be able to replicate that, we incorporated silver nanoparticles which have antibacterial properties. But by themselves, they are the silver nanoparticles at the concentration at which we had incorporated them into the scaffold, they were non-toxic to the skin cells by themselves. So which is why they allowed cellular proliferation to happen.
Another question is, what are the current major challenges in the development of 3D in vitro cancer models, and which cancer type is most difficult to recapitulate in vitro model, and why?
I think it is a very diffuse question. One of the challenge, I mean, in general, the challenges which I can state is that if you are developing the cancer models in the form of spheroids, at what density the cells are being seeded, for how many number of days the spheroids are being developed, what techniques you are utilizing to develop the spheroids, whether it is matrix based or whether it is matrix free, would all govern the physiological likeness of that model as compared to the in vivo conditions. With regards to the models being developed for different type of cancers, we have had experience only with a few cancer types in our laboratory. So I can't generalize those observations to all type of cancers. So we have worked with lung cancer, we have worked with breast cancer. So these are the two types, and we are going to initiate research in some form of retinal cancer also. But at this stage, I would not be able to generalize that answer to cancer types, which is a vast area.
Another question from Chaitra Jaiswal. In what ratio lung cancer cells and fibroblasts were used to make the spheroids?
So again, this would be available in the matrix. We seeded the cells at different numbers, and those cell numbers which gave us adequate spheroid sizes were then optimized or were chosen as optimum for further investigations. So that form of optimization has to be done by anybody who is working in the area, especially in the area of spheroid culture, that with each different cell type that you're using, optimization studies need to be conducted by working with different ratios and by working with different cell numbers, as well as by optimizing the number of days over which the spheroids are being cultivated.
Another question is, can involuntary muscles be produced using bioprinting technology?
Like cardiac muscles?
Yeah,
So
something of
people have done. So I have also presented it in my introductory slides that yes, people have attempted to print cardiac muscles as well. So there has been research which has been conducted in this area.
There's a query by Dr. Deepak Kanabur. A very interesting, informative presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was not. It was a question by Ranita Ghosh. Are you also planning to work on diabetic foot ulcer?
So these bandages which we have developed, so we have conducted wound healing studies in animals. So because of the limited size of the wounds that are formed in case of diabetic foot ulcers, these bandages, yes, they could be utilized for the treatment of diabetic foot ulcer. Of course, we need collaborations with companies to be able to take this idea further. I mean, we need to work
Yes.
with the industry to be able to conduct advanced studies that will prove the clinical efficacy.
Yeah. There's also a comment by Sandra. She's from the European Commission Joint Research Committee. She says, thank you, Professor Prajakta, for an amazing lecture. Great to see your work on evaluating biopharmaceuticals, wound healing technology, advancements, 3D models, spheroids, etc. So in Europe, we have a drive towards green pharmaceuticals. So EU has also launched a funding call. The link is there in the chat. You can go through that, and with your experience and in alternative approaches, natural made materials, green agents, how you see this area of green pharmaceuticals, including fully animal free next generation non-animal methods developing in the near future. So how do you see them develop in the near future, and what is the scope for these
Yes,
green
so
pharmaceuticals?
yeah, definitely. So now people are shifting from the traditional methods of synthesis of even the APIs as well as the drug delivery systems to more environmentally. So like solvents like the deputectic solvents or ionic liquids, etc., are being increasingly utilized. Or in certain cases, even solid phase synthesis, etc., is being utilized. Micro reactors are being utilized for the API synthesis, so as to be, make the processes greener in nature. People are working with biopolymers and easily biodegradable materials. So there is definitely a shift towards development of more environmentally benign approaches, which is also one of the major focuses of the research which is being conducted in our laboratory.
Yeah, just adding to that, a question from my side is, uh, like in terms of research, it is beautiful. Like the results have been showed in your lab, but how do you, like, what are the challenges do you see in terms of translating that into actual products and getting them into market and industry challenges? So how do you
Yeah.
comment on that?
So this is, you're asking about the 3D models, right? Your question or about
Yes,
the 3D models. So yes, so
3D model.
it is possible that till a certain stage, the models are being tested in the laboratory. After that, there are funding schemes by the government, especially the ATGC, where after you have established a proof of concept, you can apply for those funding schemes so as to be able to validate the models in a better way. Once the models are validated, however, it would require collaborative work with industries so as to be able to validate them at different centers, or so as to be able to validate them on a still larger scale. And ultimately, it is the industry who are going to be the end users. So after that, the preliminary validation stage, it is very much necessary for the industrial partners to, handhold with the researchers so that these technologies are actually able to see, they're actually able to translate into the market.
Yeah. So having said that, I think there are no more questions, but there are a lot of appreciation comments. So maybe you can just skim through it.
Thank you so much.
And
I'm attention and your
yeah. So I think we can now end the session. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, I think that should be okay on your email. So if
Yes, so yeah, and I access my institute ID quite frequently. So yes, I mean that is definitely a possibility.
Yeah, so people in the audience, if anyone wants to reach out to Dr. Dandekar, you could reach out to her on her email ID. It's on our website. So having said that, so now I would we come to the end of this session, and
Once
from
again, before you
CPHMS.
end, I thank you
Sure.
and Surak for having me here today, and it was nice to interact and to be able to discuss about our technologies on this platform. So
Sure,
thank you to
sure.
you as well as to Surak.
Yeah. So from our side, from the Center for Predictive Human Model Systems, we thank you for taking your time out and interacting with the audience. Also, we also thank the audience who have taken their time out and attended this webinar on a Saturday morning. And we hope to see you all in the future webinars. Just for information, this is the 12th webinar in the series, so it's kind of an anniversary, like the first anniversary of our webinar series. And we also want to continue this further and enable human relevant and non-animal research in India and make it see through the day. Having said that, I thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Dandekar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye.